of wisdom. This is what God has intended for us to do. This is the path he has intended for us to follow. And if we do, there is tremendous reward, tremendous blessing. And but there's always tangents. There's always temptations to get off of that path, and they're just dead ends. There's consequences for those paths. And so God is reminding us all the way through this book, stay in my will, stay on the path of wisdom, and there is reward. So today we're in Proverbs chapter 17, and we want to zero in on God's design for the family. And if I had to give a command, I would simply say, be the family member God intended you to be. Allow the family dynamic to function the way God intended it to function. And so Proverbs chapter 17 and verse number 1 says, better is a dry morsel and quietness therewith than a house full of sacrifices with strife. A wise servant shall have rule over a son that causeth shame, and shall have part of the inheritance among the brethren. The fining pot is for silver, and the furnace for gold, but the Lord trieth the hearts. A wicked doer giveth heed to false lips, and a liar giveth ear to a naughty tongue. Whoso mocketh the poor reproacheth his maker, and he that is glad at calamities shall not be unpunished. Children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers. In these 6 verses, we find God teaching us about the function of the family, what his design is for the family. And it just, in verse number 1, it just starts out by reminding us that it would be better to be poor in a family that functions in unity and harmony and love than to be part of a family that is able to have great riches and to be able to enjoy great feasts, but they fight all the time, but they don't get along. There is tension all the time. God just starts out by saying, my design for the family is not all this tension, not all this bickering, not all this fighting and turmoil and strife. That's not what I intended the family to be. My design for the family is that they function in unity, that they demonstrate biblical love, and that they enjoy harmony together. Verse number 2 gives a warning and a rebuke, and it says, children, did you know that in order to carry your family name appropriately, you're going to have to be a person of character and integrity? You're going to have to make some wise decisions. You're going to have to live with some parameters and some discretion. And verse 2 says, a wise servant, someone who operates in the will of God with the intent of God on the path of wisdom. This servant actually could indeed carry on the family name, literally carry on the family business, be blessed by parents, even at the expense of a son who goes astray, a son who is self-centered and selfish and carnal and earthly minded. Maybe the best illustration Solomon could give was his own son, Rehoboam. For Rehoboam was the heir apparent. Rehoboam was the child that was supposed to take over. Oftentimes in businesses, that's what we see is that dad will leave the business to a child. And usually, because he knows what it took to get the business going, he's going to leave it to a child who's shown some responsibility, some integrity. Sometimes the children are so spoiled and so self-centered that the dad says, I'd love to leave it with my kids, but I can't trust them with the business. And he'll literally leave it to an employee who has demonstrated that kind of integrity. And so Rehoboam lost his kingdom that was divided and really handed it over to Jeroboam, who was a former employee of Solomon. And so, Solomon could understand this principle. But it doesn't change what God's intent was. God's intent was dads want to leave it to their children. Dads want to bless their children. And so there's a couple of things here. He talks about families go through trials and difficulties, but they should go through them together. That idea of the fiery, finding I can't read it. The finding pot is for silver and the furnace for gold. He's talking about the refining process of silver, the purifying process of gold. These things are God's intent to help, never to hurt. And families should go through trials, and it makes them closer. Trials ought not divide a family. They ought not drive a wedge. Boy, so many times in my ministry, I've watched in the death of a parent where the children fight and bicker over stuff that's just temporal. That's just not God's plan. They fight and argue over who is supposed to get what, and instead of honoring their parents, honoring God, fulfilling God's purpose, there's this fighting, bickering, and strife, and it's just totally out of the will of God. And so that trial process is actually to bring families closer together. And then it warns the wicked doer giveth heed to false lips. In other words, family should not believe just what they hear about everybody from everyone else. And they certainly shouldn't be telling what's going on in the family to everyone else. The family ought to function in a way that brings unity. They solve problems together. They grow together. They go forward together because this unity is God's design. And even if you're poor, if you have that harmony and unity and love, it's way better than no matter how much money, no matter how easy you live, when there's strife, fighting, and bickering all the time. And then he concludes it in verse number 6 when he says, children's children are the crown of old men. In other words, I have grandchildren. I love my granddaughters to death, and I am so thankful for them, and they bring incredible joy to my heart. I'm so thankful for them. And that's God's design. It's God's design that's what children would be able to provide for their parents, and to bring that added joy, that added blessing. And so the response that fathers should be proud, the end of that says, and the glory of children are their fathers. In other words, it's not just separating fathers from mothers, but it's really giving us the idea of parents. Parents ought to be so proud of their children. But in order to do that, children have to be people of integrity. They have to be willing to walk the path of wisdom. And so if that's what happens, there is incredible blessing, unity, harmony, love that's displayed in the family. And that is God's plan. And so whether you're the parent, or whether you're the child, or whether you're the grandchild, you should realize that there is a dynamic that God wants you to bind together to be a testimony of the relationship that God the Son had with his Father, and the beautiful unity that portrays in the Trinity ought to be on display in our Christian homes. I hope this is a blessing to you. May God bless you. We'll